everybody. If we haven't met, my name is Matt. Glad to have you here. I want to show you a picture of my favorite car I've ever owned. It's right here. So I got to tell this story without really looking at Kyle as a mechanic because I'm definitely not a car guy. I don't know anything about cars. One Sunday morning, I was driving into church and my transmission died. And in between services, a friend said, you kind of seemed not yourself today. And I said, I think my car's dead. And he said, well, I have this old car that's not on the road, but I'll just give it to you if you want to come check it out. And so it was this car. And I gave him $1 because I felt like, I'm not a cheapskate, so I gave him $1 and got it towed to a garage where another friend worked, and for not that much was able to get this. So it's a 1987 BMW 535 IS, which sounds like I know what I'm talking about. I don't. Sometimes when I was in parking lots, people would say, oh, is that the one? Nice car. Is that the one with the E28 engine? And at first I didn't know, and then once I caught up, I'd be like, yeah, you know your cars too. Try to play up with it. If they asked the second question, I was in trouble. But anyways, this car was great, and I had it for a couple years, but it was really quirky. Like the driver's side window was a power window. It would work maybe 60% of the time. Often at the drive-thru, I'd have to get out of my car. Have you ever seen those people? Yeah, that was me getting out to get the coffee, or there was no heat. So the first winter I was driving this car, if you could get it warmed up enough and then slowly get going, there was enough kind of wind going through it that it would kind of work. But when it got really cold, we were in trouble. The next picture here, so this was the evening after our Christmas Eve services, and the weather just dropped, and this was me trying to drive home. And I pulled over and called Bobby and said, I'm going to be a little bit longer than I thought. I can't see. There's just no heat. And so then my brain kind of tries to get creative, and so a few days later, sometime in the Christmas break, I went to Canadian Tire and bought one of those eliminators. Again, I'm not going to look at Kyle, but I bought one of these eliminators that plugs into the cigarette lighter that gives you an outlet, and I thought if I buy that and a blow dryer, I'm fine. Like I can just drive and do this, like no problem. And then it wouldn't work. I guess, I don't know, something wasn't working, and then I thought, well, maybe I need to hardwire something into the engine because there's not enough coming out from the cigarette lighter. So I went back to Canadian Tire, returned those things, and then I bought a little ceramic heater, thinking, well, this will now warm up the car and maybe defrost. And I thought, if I just figure a way of like tying this into the battery, I don't know what I was thinking. Somehow I thought I could do this. And so I was down on my hands and knees at the driver's side, and I was trying to pull the carpet back, figuring out, like, there's got to be a way for me to bring this cord through, and somehow just cut off the plug and, I don't know, wire it in or something. I don't know. Anyways, and it was in that moment where I saw this little black box, the fuse box. And like an idiot, all of a sudden it hit me like, oh, I wonder if it's just a fuse that's the issue, why the fan won't work and there's no defrost and no heat. So back to Canadian Tire, and for like $1.49, you could buy like 12 of these little fuses, and brought them back and was sitting in the car, and I just said a prayer like, God, you're my provider. Like, just make this work. I put the fuse in and I fired it up and everything worked. And it was like, it was a Christmas miracle. And I just thought, you know what? This little tiny fuse helped make everything work, and it was the connection. All that. Sometimes in our spiritual lives, we do those kinds of things too. We just leave it and assume that just over time, if we just get warmed up, if we have enough forward momentum, eventually there's going to be some warmth, some signs of life, some heat. It will clear things up enough that we can see where we're needing to go. Boom, we're off. Or maybe we're like, let's just get creative and we'll try this and that, and we'll experiment, we'll do these things, we'll leave them behind without any kind of like guide, without any real indication of what we should do, and willing to experiment. And then maybe we eventually get to the place where we just are honest with ourselves and we're like trying our own way or waiting to see what will happen. That doesn't really lead us anywhere. And you just become aware that maybe it's because we're not actually connected into the true source of life then. Maybe the thing isn't about us being more creative. Maybe it's actually because we're distanced from the one who has created us and has called us to be in relationship. And as we talked about last week in John chapter 15, as Jesus being the vine, the source of life, that any fruit we have in our life is because we are connected to Jesus. And so we're in this series, just getting it going, talking about spiritual disciplines, spiritual practices. And this week in particular, we're talking about the rhythm of Sabbath. So some of you will be familiar with even the term Sabbath or what it means, but we're going to spend this morning just talking about what Sabbath looks like as a discipline, as a spiritual practice. All these ones that we're going to be covering in this series are rhythms and patterns and practices that we have seen throughout not only the pages of Scripture, but also in the practice of the early church and then the church up until today. And in different times, even in Sabbath, there's different times where we would look at a practice and the way it was rolled out, the way it was understood, or the way it was incorporated into life has changed over time. And so even as we look at how the early church practiced Sabbath and what that looks like for us today, I think there'll be hopefully some good thoughts, and I think also some challenging things of what it means to be connected with God in the practice of Sabbath. So grab your Bibles. We're going to start in Genesis chapter 2. The QR code on the screen will help you. We're moving through a number of different passages as we kind of work our way across this topic, but you can use that certainly to get yourself, to track along and get yourself situated. But while we're turning there, just a couple announcements from our side, from my side, that we want to let and communicate to everyone. The first thing is on Sunday, May 17th, we're going to one service. So it'll be at 10 o'clock. So we have done this. We've had this pattern of moving back to one service. And so we looked at the numbers over the last couple years. And if you were here last year, kind of in those beginning weeks of June, particularly in the second service, it was probably like, why don't we go to one service earlier? Because everyone was here, there, and everywhere. And so Mother's Day is the weekend before. Everyone note that. You could also jot that down, May 10th, little heads up. But then starting May 17th, which is the long weekend, that's when we're going to go to one service at 10 o'clock. So just giving you time to think about that. And it'll be great. Everyone from both services, whoever's around, will be all together. And we'll do that through the summer. And then on the summer front, I've decided to move back to summer Wednesdays. And so pretty pumped about that, pretty excited. Some of you, if you've been around for a while, you'll know that we've done this before. A number of years ago, we have tried an experiment for a number of different reasons and different kind of heartbeats of moving our service, recognizing that it's not about the particular day, but Wednesdays afford us a time, an opportunity to engage with our neighborhood and our community in a whole different way. And so the last 2 years we have been off that, but we're moving back and trying it again with kind of a renewed sense of hope and optimism and what that could look like for us with intentionality. One of the things for this year is talking about and focusing on helping with food insecurity in our city. And even if you think on a practical level, the idea of every Wednesday night being out in the parking lot with tables and preparing meals and inviting our neighbors and friends to come and at least share a meal, whether or not they come in here for the service or not, it doesn't matter. We're visible, we're there, and we're a part of that. And so we'll be talking more about if you want to join some food teams or what that will look like. And it's also, I think, an interesting rhythm for us when our time and culture weekends in the summer are definitely cherished here. As I was reminded again when the snowfall was coming down, was that yesterday or Friday? I'm like, when is spring happening? That everyone kind of lives into those summer weekends and people are traveling in a way that Wednesdays, as long as you're not on vacation, if you're working, you're in the city. And so it gives us an opportunity to gather in between our regular times. I know some people love this idea and are so glad we're back. I know some others don't like it. I know some people I've never been here for that, and so maybe you're unsure, but just stick with it. It's going to be great. And also say, hey, if you love going to church on a Sunday morning, we're not going to be checking up on you if you decide to visit other churches on Sunday, okay? Go for it. We're all part of the same group, same team. No one's taking attendance. But in September, we're expected to be back, okay? So that's all we're saying. So, okay. Anyway, so those are a couple of things coming up, and it will start on Wednesday, July 1st, which is Canada Day, with a big Canada Day celebration and barbecue in the parking lot. Okay, enough said. Let's get rolling. Let's talk about Sabbath here. So some of you will be familiar with the term. It's kind of a weird word, right? If you didn't grow up in the church, Sabbath might feel like a bit strange. Maybe more familiar would be like sabbatical, like in an academic setting, but it comes from the Hebrew root word Shabbat, which means to cease or to pause or to rest or to stop. That's the idea, just this slowing down, this intentional pause. And in the Old Testament scriptures, we see the word Shabbat about 60 times all throughout the Old Testament scriptures, and it was woven into the life and the rhythm of the ancient people of Israel. And we discover it actually from the very beginning pages, Genesis chapter 2, in the creation account itself. So as God is calling all things into existence, as he's setting everything up, we find that God himself establishes this pattern of rest, which isn't just he ran out of things to create and he quit creation. It's an intentional modeling for us of what rest looks like in our rhythm. So let's read that together. Genesis chapter 2, verse 2 and 3, it says this. It says, by the seventh day God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day he rested. So that's the Shabbat word, which is the root word for Shabbat. So when it says rested, this is this idea of to pause, to renew, to take a break. From all his work, it says, then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So there's an example for us. It wasn't a failure. Whenever we talk about rest or Sabbath or ceasing to push forward and to be productive, it's not a failure. You're not a loser for pausing. In fact, it's how God has created us to be, to take renewal, to find joy and delight in the pauses, in the time and space spent with God and with each other. This is the rhythm for a holy life, for a holy rest. You should have this. This is what God kind of built into us. Now, I know as we work our way through, I would suspect that there's going to be a little bit of tension that grows in our guts for some of us because it feels so countercultural to intentionally stop. Who stops? You're always on. You keep going. Your value your identity is measured in how productive you are and what you produce and what you can accomplish, right? Well, let's talk more about that as we get going. Anyways, also notice that he calls the seventh day holy, not because of the day necessarily it is, but simply just because it's that day. By his proximity and his blessing, that time and space is considered holy. Just by what it is. It's not about going to a special place that's considered holy. It's just the time in itself, which we'll talk a little bit more in a second here. So now let's spend a little bit of a moment. We see established here in the creative account, God wiring this into who we are in our rhythm for what life should look like. When you want to talk about rhythms of life and spiritual practices that transform and change us when we're connected to Jesus, this idea of rest, of stopping, of ceasing, for delight, for joy, should be part of our rhythm. So turn now, if you have your Bibles or in your phone, to Exodus chapter 20. I want to just spend a quick moment here. We're not obviously going to go through the many, many different instances we see Sabbath, Shabbat showing up in the Old Testament text, but I want to give you one where we see it in the life of the ancient Israelites. So this is Exodus chapter 20. They have just come out of over 400 years of slavery in Egypt. Moses is leading them through the desert. They have this promise of going to this promised land that God will show them. And at this point in the story, they are at the base of Mount Sinai, and Moses has gone up the mountain to receive the instructions of the Lord about what does it mean to be the community of God, the people of God. And he receives the 10 Commandments, and that's where we read this, Exodus 20, verse 8 and on. It says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. This is the instructions God is giving to Moses for the people. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your sons or daughters, nor your male or female servants, nor your animals, nor any foreigners residing in your towns. Verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. So it's a sign of identity that shows up here, right? Like pointing them back to the creation account. Hey, remember how God called all these things into existence? He called it holy. He himself practiced this. Remember, like hearkening back, remember this. This is your identity as a people of God, is to follow the model and the example of God himself in creation. But it's also this symbol not only of identity, but also of resistance. So remember, as they come out of Egypt, their whole existence, their whole identity was defined by those who were oppressing them, by what they could produce, by what they could do. So by saying we're intentionally stopping, it's not what we're going to do. We're modeling and modeling our lives after what God has demonstrated and shown us. That's what gives us life. It's also this reminder that we aren't what we produce. It's this kind of hearkening back to slavery where their identity was rooted in what they could produce, perhaps even their life themselves if they weren't productive enough to the slave masters. This is your holy identity. This is what makes you who you are. Walter Brueggemann writes this. He says, Sabbath became a decisive, concrete, visible way of opting for and aligning with the God of rest against the Pharaoh of productivity. There's this resistance, this pushback of how maybe the world wants to define us and our value. So practically speaking, Sabbath for the ancient Jewish people would be a 24-hour period that would begin on sundown on Friday evening And then Sabbath was on Saturday till sundown on Saturday. And it would often begin, and still today, would begin with lighting candles and saying prayers and being together as a family. You would do no work. And you would begin and celebrate. You would have meals of celebration. You would have time together. You would look back and remember who God was and what he has done for you. It's not by what you can produce that gives you value. It's simply in God's provision. Again, this was a reminder back to the days when they were wandering through the wilderness and God provided all their food, the manna from heaven. And he would give them a double supply prior to the Sabbath as a reminder to them, like, you don't have to do anything for your next meals. I'm going to produce double for you so that you are fully cared for. And this is this pattern. They would share meals and they would read and discuss scripture. They would have corporate times of worship, a meeting together on the Sabbath day, the Saturday together, which still is the practice for observant Jews to this day. So this was this pattern over and over. Now let's roll in as this is all going through. This is who they were as the people of God, their identity, there's resistance to this culture of productivity, and this is what defines me. And then it comes into Jesus. So Jesus as a Jewish man, what was going on for him as he comes on the scene then? First century Sabbath, what did this look like? So by this point, it had become obviously a central institution. So it was woven into the fabric of the nation, but it had taken on this whole other look. So the law, the Old Testament law, outlined what Sabbath would look like and a whole bunch of other ways of what it meant to be the people of God. But the priests and the scribes, they started coming up with what they call the oral tradition, the oral law, which was codified in this book called the Mishnah. And it was this whole other list of rules and regulations. So here's scripture, but here's what it means to live these things out. So around the Sabbath itself, there were over 60 categories of what keeping the Sabbath holy looked like. And each category had its own set of regulations. And the thinking as they started writing these ideas was they wanted to kind of create a fence, right? They're trying to keep people safe so they don't wander out and fail to keep the Sabbath holy. But over time, what's happening is if you have 60 categories of all these rules, like hundreds of extra rules, it becomes this whole other burden on the people, this whole other sense of legalism. What you can do, what you can't do. Watch out for this, don't do that. When I was in Israel a number of years ago with Bobby, and I remember as we were staying at this hotel the night before, right before sundown, like the hotel completely changed. Like all the elevators would automatically change to stop on every single floor because pushing the button was too much work. Or the kinds of foods you have would all be laid out ahead of time. Like all these kinds of things happen. We just kind of saw it happen before our eyes. But certainly in this time, there was all these things that were happening, all these different rules, all these different categories. So let me give you a few of the examples. So there were things around like your crops and your food. So you weren't allowed to do any sowing or plowing or reaping or threshing or grinding or sifting or kneading or baking, anything to produce a meal. From your livestock or your clothing, you weren't allowed to shear wool or wash wool or beat wool or dye any wool or spinning, weaving. You weren't allowed to scrape or to cure hides. You weren't allowed to kill any of your livestock for food. You weren't allowed to salt any meat for preservation. Even things like this, you weren't allowed to write 2 or more letters. You weren't allowed to erase anything in order to write. You weren't allowed to tie or untie. You weren't allowed to build or demolish. You weren't allowed to use a hammer to strike a final blow, which would seem like your building project is finished. You weren't allowed to start a fire, put out a fire, all these kinds of things. All these different rules, all these different ideas of keeping people in, and it felt like, wait, is Sabbath for us to give us delight and rest in the Lord, or is this a way of like controlling and now, man, Sabbath feels really hard, doesn't it? I grew up in what I would class kind of a conservative home where my dad was a pastor, and we had our own list of Sabbath rules. Some of you may have grown up in a similar environment. So I just want to share what Sabbath rules at the Vincent would look like, household would look like on Sundays. So the approved list, here's the things that you could do on a Sunday. Here's things you could do. You could go to church for Sunday school and then morning service, and then if there was an after-service lunch, then you go home, but then you'd come back for evening service. So that was okay. You could, and in between those services and times at church, you could read as long as it wasn't anything too crazy. You could take a nap. That seems holy. You could visit family or other church friends. You could have a big Sunday lunch. That was always a big thing, a good family lunch. You could listen to Christian music as long as it wasn't too upbeat, like Petra was a dangerous thing. If you don't know what Petra is, I'm not sure I should encourage you to look that up or not, but you could play calm indoor games with 2 other brothers was next to impossible. That just didn't happen. There was no such thing. But those are the things you could do. Made Sundays go by really slowly. You couldn't play outside. You couldn't do anything like that. Couldn't ride your bike. But what you couldn't, you were not allowed to do these. You couldn't run. You couldn't play any sports. You couldn't be outside. There was no Sunday shopping or spending money unless maybe you went to Swiss Chalet. That was okay. But then weren't other people forced to work? How are we making that? I don't know, gymnastics on that one. How are you? No yard work or chores, no TV, nothing loud. You had to be quiet. Not really hanging out with regular, normal. Not that church friends aren't normal, but like neighborhood friends. Like I didn't have a lot of friends in the church in Toronto, but like all my neighborhood friends were outside playing like, do you know what wall ball is? Do they play wall ball here? Yeah. Like that was huge. Or street hockey. Like everyone else is having so much fun and you're sitting inside, I don't know, reading your Bible or something. I'm joking, but Sundays were so boring as a kid that I couldn't wait to go back to church that night. Like how bad is it for a kid when your version of like Sabbath rest is let's go back to church for an evening service where I just sit in the pew anyways. But these were the fences. We laugh about it as a family, but these were the kind of the fences of what it meant to kind of keep the Sabbath holy. So now turn over to Mark chapter 2 with all these ideas of these rules and these categories of what it meant to keep the Sabbath holy. I want to read this for you, and I want to point out why this was so offensive, what Jesus and his disciples were doing, because it occurred on the Sabbath and the religious leaders watching them. So Mark chapter 2, let's begin at verse 23. It said this. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain, which would have been considered reaping. Right? They're taking and sowing the grain or reaping the grain here, which would have been work, which was now not keeping the Sabbath holy. So in verse 24, we pick it up. The Pharisees said to him, to Jesus, look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? This wasn't an Old Testament law. This was a Jewish oral law that was tied all mixed in together. Verse 25, he answered, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread. So that's bad in multiple ways. Consecrated bread was only to be eaten by priests at certain times, which is lawful only for the priest to eat. He also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So Jesus here is affirming the intentional purpose of Sabbath as a gift from God to us as part of his creation. That it's never meant to be a burden or to hold you down or to constrict you. It's supposed to spark life and joy and give you moments to love God and to love others, to find rest and refreshment and celebration and good meals and time together. Remember, we're not slaves to the Sabbath. It doesn't control us. But that's not what had ended up happening. Marva Dawn, in her work, Keeping the Sabbath Holy, she writes, whenever Sabbath keeping becomes merely a legalistic system of rules, it loses its wondrous freedom and delight. The Sabbath is meant for joy, not obligation. Wish my parents had read that. So this is what was going on. This was the context as Jesus was growing up as a Jewish man in that time and place, as he is bringing his teaching and establishing his kingdom. There's these tensions that are happening between what was considered law and legal and binding by the religious elite, and Jesus is reminding them of the freedom that's supposed to happen when it comes to Sabbath. This is a practice that gives us life as we're connected back to God. So let's talk about Sabbath meeting Sunday and how it happened in the life of the early church. So in the early days, most of the followers of Jesus were Jewish people. It began as a localized kind of teaching with Jesus and his disciples, and so most of the Jewish people, as they became followers of Jesus, continued then to meet on Saturday, on their traditional Sabbath, kind of reworking their understanding of what it meant, but they continued to do that. Like in Acts chapter 13, it says, on the Sabbath, they entered the synagogue and sat down. So this was regular for them. So instead of waiting for the Messiah to come, believing that Jesus was the Messiah, they still kind of kept their Saturday rhythm and practice in terms of observing the Sabbath. Jesus coming didn't get rid of all that. They were just practicing Sabbath in a different way. But then, as you imagine, as more and more people who weren't Jewish, as the church began to spread throughout the Roman Empire, more and more Gentiles, non-Jewish people, became followers of Jesus. And so they had never been tied to the idea of Saturday as Sabbath. It was never in kind of their rhythms. And so what ended up happening is they began to, as followers of Jesus, began to meet on the first day of the week as a way of commemorating and celebrating Jesus' victory, his resurrection that happened on the first day of the week. That's how it became known as the Lord's Day, celebrating Jesus' resurrection. And some would do both. They would recognize kind of the history and also the Lord's Day on Sunday. And anyways, it began to work itself out. So in Acts chapter 20, as Paul is kind of the missionary to the Gentile non-Jewish people, we read this in Acts chapter 20. It says in verse 7, it says, on the first day of the week, we came together to break bread, which was an act of remembrance and celebration of community, spiritual community. And Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, he kept on talking until midnight. That's a long service. But so we can kind of see how this transition happens from the Jewish Shabbat, Sabbath, to now in the New Testament church, transitioning to Sunday being the Lord's Day. This was a transitional period, so much so that everyone kind of started noticing these changes. And there was a bishop of Antioch named Ignatius, and he wrote about this. Ancient Antioch would have been Syria, what we call Syria now. And so he writes, I want to read some of his writing when he's reflecting on this transition and change. He says this, Ignatius of Antioch in 110 AD, he says, those who are brought up in the ancient order of things have come to the possession of a new hope, no longer observing the Sabbath, but living in the observance of the Lord's Day, on which also our life has sprung up again by him and by his death. So this is kind of this rhythm of Sabbath. It didn't disappear through the centuries. It just kind of shifted and changed, and Jesus gave new definition or a new reminding of what it looked like, and the early church then adopted this and moved on. And then in Hebrews chapter 4, Paul, writing to the church at Rome, is saying the same thing. He says in verse 9, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. This continues on for the people of God, for the followers of Jesus. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from him. So through the rhythm and patterns of Scripture, from God establishing it in creation, to the ancient Israelites practicing it, and then to Jesus growing up as a Jewish man in a Jewish context, and then the early church, and then spreading throughout the empire, and to what we now observe, the Sabbath has always been part of our practice, but throughout centuries and time, it has looked different in different cultures, in different times, in different seasons, all the way up to today. So when we talk about Sabbath today, it still has a place for us, but what kind of place does it hold? What does Sabbath look like for us as followers of Jesus today in this part of Canada, in this province, in this building here? So I'm going to pause there. I want to share some thoughts with you, but let's just hold off there. I really want to give you a chance to chat with someone, and I would love to hear what you're thinking. I know we're just greasing those wheels and getting everyone ready to have conversations, but take a minute now. What about this spiritual discipline or practice stands out to you? Does it remind you of something? Does it spark any questions or curiosity? Just going to give you a minute. You can just be quiet and reflect on your own if you don't want to talk, or talk to a friend or someone near you. And I'm just going to give you a couple minutes. I'll call you back together, and then we'll pass a couple mics, okay? All right, go for it. All right, call you back together. Love to invite anyone who is interested. Just throw up your hand, and we'll get a mic to you. Love to hear some of the things you were chatting about, wondering about. Anyone want to start us off here? Someone with the birthday closest to today has to go first. Anyone want to jump in? Oh, yeah. Rob. And please, if there's someone else, just throw up. Jeff's ready. Hey, morning, Rob.
Good morning. A couple of things that came up were, we're talking both about how sometimes maybe you're doing something that would be considered work, but it's kind of life-giving in some ways. Like, for example, having friends over and cooking for them. You know, you're cooking, you're doing work, but it's like you're also loving and enjoying it. That was something that came up. Another thing that came up was if you think of work as just your job, you know, a lot of people would be off. Not everyone, but a lot of people would be off on Sundays already. It's not really that hard, but it's like all the house projects you got to do, or the We're heading into the summer, the spring and summer, and so everyone's going to be getting their garden beds ready, and all this stuff we got to do to get your house ready. And it's like, you're working during the week, so anyone with young kids knows that any house project gets done on the weekend. So, and it's usually not one day. So how do you figure all that? Like, how are you able to do all that? And is that against the rule? It's just like, it's very hard to conceptualize how to do this practically. And we go through periods like, my wife and I both read Ruthless Elimination in a Hurry, and we were like, yeah, okay, we're gonna do it. And did the whole Friday night to Saturday night, and then reading John Tyson's The Burden is Light. Like, there's so many things we read and we get really excited about it, and then it lasts such a short amount of time. We were never able to actually really sustain it. Yeah. So, and part of me, we crave it. We crave that rest. Like, that's we've had a crazy week. It's one of the reasons why my wife actually did stay home to rest today and didn't come here so that she could just take a breath. Mm-hmm. And so we crave rest, but implementing it seems to be nearly impossible.
Yeah.
So those are just some observations.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we'll talk about that as we go. Like, how is it even possible for us to do this? I don't know if it's just our issue or if it's always been an issue. I think that I want to come back to the thing that you started with, the idea of, like, for some people, having friends over for a dinner is so life-giving. Yeah, it requires work, but it's about something that fills them up, and there's like this sense of like joy and community and hospitality, and you can exercise your spiritual gifts even in those moments, and encouragement and laughter. Other people, the idea of like getting ready or wanting to have people over is like, that is not cup filling. So it can look different. I was even talking to someone long ago and a while ago, kind of a well-known author, and he was saying that his wife loves gardening. You brought up yard projects or whatever. So for her on Sabbath, she loves to garden, and he stays away from it. That's when he goes to do a walk to the coffee shop or something. Because different things for different people, even in like marriages, are life-giving. So I think the thing about Sabbath, its intent is how do we do and practice the things where we stop doing the things that order the rest of our 6 days, and we say, we're purely going to focus on the things about relationships and family and God that are life-giving for us. And it's called a discipline, I think, because it's going to take work for all of us. I don't think you necessarily become expert at Sabbath, but I would say our encouragement should be, well, if we can't get it right for 24 hours, we shouldn't do it at all. I think our encouragement should be, we need to be moving in this direction, like any spiritual discipline or practice. But I have a few other thoughts on that, because similar ideas in our family too, Rob. One more person want to jump in? Yeah, Kara.
I don't know how well this will come out because my brain's still processing it, but I was really struck by the Israelites needing that identity change from slaves to this concept of having the Sabbath, that productivity to rest.
Yeah.
And I know that in our lives, God is trying to transform us into new creations. And sometimes I try anyway to try something new or do this, but unless it's coming from that really rooted place of that understanding my identity, it's hard to make it last.
Yeah.
So that's really fascinating to me that he made that identity change for them to produce the behavior that he wanted to see rather than them. But of course, then they went too far. And they added all this other stuff. They added all these behaviors that weren't coming from the root of the identity, which is, I also do that. So It was really interesting.
Yeah, that's good. So 430 years, they were slaves in Egypt. So think about how many generations 430 years represents, and how that's now woven not only into their like history, but into their social fabric, their physiology, the nonstop, their sense of value and identity and relating to each other. This would shift. Like if we had 400 years of a pattern, we're completely different people. So the hard reset from the 10 Commandments is to remind them, yes, all you can remember as far back as great-great-great-great-granny is slavery. But you know what? Before that, God created you in his image. He was very pleased. Intimate relationship with the divine, created in his order, and he models for us rhythms. So it's this whole factory reset, and there's no way it would have been easy. So even when we're thinking about it today, if we're thinking, well, how do we just jumpstart this? Let's just put in the fuse and we're back to Sabbath. It's not going to be like that for any of us, I would imagine. But the principle, the idea of what it means to be connected through this practice is something we need to stare at, I think. So yeah, thank you for mentioning that. So here's a couple thoughts for me. Question for you. Does it seem like everything we've talked about today, this idea of practicing Sabbath, just seems, a day, 24 hours seems great, but just practically completely impossible? Probably many people would say, like, that's just impossible. How do we slow down that way? I don't know about other generations, certainly, but our culture is addicted to producing and this compulsion to always be on and produce, and sometimes taking a break can seem like a waste of time, and there can be a sense of guilt to say no or to stop, to put up even your own fences, your own sense of boundaries. That can be really hard. Work demands, pressures to stay productive, accessible 24 hours a day. We're always reachable, always on. Even family schedules, things that can be life-giving in the beginning, can soon take on a life of their own. If you think about traveling and extended family or kids' activities or practices or training, household chores, never-ending to-do list, Rob, fear of missing out. Well, if I am doing this, then I'm missing out on all these other things. There just can be this anxiety that grows in us, and we equate it to laziness if we're not producing, because our culture has woven that, and it's like just pushed that into us so strongly for generations now. And I have been a victim of that my whole life. If you ascribe to Enneagram, I'm a 3, which is an achiever, and when I'm not in my best place, I link my identity and the way people think about me by what I'm able to do and produce. And it's when I've surrendered that to Jesus, it can be a great thing, and when I mismanage it, it can be terrible and hurt people because of that and hurt myself because of that. So the question, I guess, is if Sabbath seems completely impossible for us, does that mean that Sabbath is just, we're okay to say it's just incompatible with 2026? Or should that force us to consider, well, what is going on in our lives that makes us think that the idea of practicing Sabbath is ridiculous? What do we do with that? Sabbath has always been God's way of saying, slow down, stop, pause. You got to know your limits. Ultimately, it's not you who's in control, it's me. It's not what you do that God loves you, what you're able to produce. It's simply who you are. We're part of a different kingdom, a different rhythm. And so a number of years ago, I'll share this quick. A number of years ago, we were not in a good place with this in terms of rhythm as a family. And we just decided we were going to do everything we could to be intentional with it. And so it may feel cheesy to you, but it was important to us. We would start, as a pastor, I was taking Friday off. And so on Thursday nights at our kitchen island, we would light a candle. And our kids kind of rolled their eyes. They were like 16 to 20 years old probably at this point, or somewhere in that zone. They kind of amused us. But we would light a candle, and we would say out loud for the next 24 hours, we just want to do things that we delight in, that give us life, that it may not be my favorite thing, but if it was one of Bobby's things, we'd maybe do that and find joy in it together. We're going to kick it off by lighting a candle. We'd say prayers together. We had a little reading we would do. We would always begin Thursday night by having a great meal. We'd talk about all week, what's the one thing we want to eat, and we would make it or order it in or whatever. And we would do our best on Friday. We'd keep the candle burning on the kitchen island for the whole 24 hours. And we kind of bumbled our way through, but it became a really fun rhythm for us to try these things together. I would say, if I'm honest with you, I'm probably not in that zone now. And I need to, it's a good reminder for me that we need to recapture that again. What does it mean if I'm trusting God, if I'm looking back on all the ways God has been faithful and I use once a week as a way of doing that? For your Sundays, I know the joke is I only work one day a week, but for your Sundays, when you're here, when you're not at your regular job, is this woven into your sense of Sabbath? Or is this an hour where you're like, I just got to hurry up and get back to the important things again? What does that look like for you to create Sabbath, to recognize dependence on God and not your doing, your producing, your excelling, to find a sense of renewal in connection with God. Jesus as the vine over the hectic pace of rush, 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 everything our culture teaches us this frantic, hectic pace, and instead settling into this holy rest. Maybe even as I'm saying this, you're like, this is crazy. Why is it so crazy for us to need to rest? Or why do we feel like a failure if we need to rest? Or to say no? What's going on there? Richard Foster, when he writes about this, he says, in the Sabbath, we are invited to rest not only from work, but in order to enter into worship, celebration, and joy. Sabbath is the pause that transforms us, that changes us, that shapes us. So ultimately, God, I just wrote, God said to chill in my notes. And my question to myself that I'll share to you is, are you aligning with the God of rest? Or are we aligning to the Pharaoh or the God of productivity? Is rest, Sabbath, part of our weekly rhythm? Are we doing it intentionally? What's stopping you from practicing that? What would it look like? What elements would you, if you were just to brainstorm, the things that give you joy in life? Probably not laundry, probably not everything else that has to happen, but maybe gardening, maybe some things around the house, but intentional time with people, intentional time around the table, intentional time doing activities that bring life together, that help you connect with each other. What would that look like? What would be on your list and what would not be on your list? Not in a legalistic way. And here's where I want to leave you. It's not a downer thing. I'd like for you to dream about it, to wonder about it. If you were to take a 24-hour span, even if you, let's just say, what if you just say, I'm going to start Saturday night, and then we're going to go to church on Sunday, and hopefully it will stretch into Sunday afternoon. We'll see how we do. But even if you just start there, Saturday evening into Sunday, and you say, I'm going to be really intentional with my time. There's going to be some time for me to reflect on who God is and what he's done, his faithfulness, his provision for me. I don't make it happen on my own. I'm going to celebrate that. I'm going to have joy in that. I'm going to go to the Wildcats game with my family because we have life in that. You know, I couldn't turn up the music. I couldn't ride my bike. I know what my parents were trying to do, but I'm like, go to the game, have people over, make pizza, whatever, go for a walk, go for a run, read a book, whatever that looks like, intentional time to not be defined by the Pharaoh, the God of our culture that tells you, that keeps teaching us and forcing down our throats, it's what you can produce and what you can do. That's how people see you. When God says, I love you unconditionally, fully. So my encouragement is, how are you going to experiment with that this week? This will probably be a more fun one to experiment with than when we get to the celibacy week, okay? So just lean into this one. If you're like, man, these are all just going to keep getting harder, just make a pizza, okay? Slow down. God wants you to chill. Will you stand with me? I just want to pray over you and for myself that we lean into this and we discover together what resting and dependence on God looks like, and we let go of this idol of needing to control and produce. So God, thanks for this reminder. Thank you that Sabbath was given to us as a rhythm of practice, this opportunity to delight and to rest and to cease from all the striving. And it's easier said than done, we get it. But God, like any spiritual practice, there's an opportunity to explore and to experiment and to try things, to try them on and see what you might teach us through them. So rather than rejecting it outright, I just want to pray for my friends here and for myself and my own family that you give us a new wonder, a new sense of joy and perspective on what this could look like in a life-giving way for us as individuals and families and community, and even those around us, God, to model that we follow we're participants in a different kingdom, we follow a different set of order. So God, thank you that practices bring us closer. Thank you that you teach us through that. Thank you for the Sabbath. Thank you for the way you model rest. Thank you for being so good and so loving to us, of recognizing that you created us to have this and to have this need, and it will be a struggle for us. And so we wait on you, God. We rest in you, Jesus. We want to connect to you as our source of life. Amen.